I mean, what's part of what I find so interesting about this moment in time and your work in particular is this the many, many parallels between this moment of the Christianization of Europe, with all of its like, you know, sometimes inaccurate interpretations, and the colonization, and with it the attempted Christianization of indigenous peoples around the world in more modern times. And there's often this, as you're telling that story, I feel I've heard Indigenous elders tell various stories of their own that are quite similar to that one, many, many centuries later in a very different, and yet, that there's an echo, right, of that moment you're describing that I have heard as well. And I'm just very curious. I'm very curious about this question of like this. Do we know how they understood religion? Because I know in many Indigenous cultures that I've encountered today, they, there is no localized or indigenous word for the term religion itself, right? And so, in this kind of early period in early medieval Europe, was the like did the would the concept of a new religion and having a new set of beliefs, like would that have had much meaning in a kind of political context where people were converting for reasons other than personal beliefs?
Okay, there's a giant kind of intellectual, methodological kind of war zone in religious studies that actually addresses this very issue, because you're right. The idea of Indigenous Europeans being like the Indigenous people that were encountered in the New World when Europeans in the late 15th and 16th centuries sailed to the Americas, the Pacific, and also started penetrating countries like India and China and Japan. This is an analogy, or not even an analogy, it's deeper than an analogy, that is used very often. The first person I think I ever heard say such a thing was James P. Mackey, who used to work at the University of Edinburgh. He is long since dead. But he addressed a conference in Celtic studies here at the University of Sydney in 1992. And he said exactly that what happened with the rollout of Christianity in the Middle Ages was a literate system of religion from an urbanized, centrally governed, bureaucratic style society, something that was closer to what we'd think of as the culture we live in now. And it was rolled out on people who were called pagans and heathens. Paganus means a country dweller. Heathen literally means someone who lives on the heath. And we should remember that civilized means the person who lives in the city. So the city is the place where all the groovy new ideas come from. And the city rolls these things out over villages and countrysides and hamlets and entirely alien populations who just don't know anything about it at all. Your second point, which is that a lot of Indigenous peoples, different language groups, different conceptual universes, don't have a word that seems to line up with the word we use called religion, is also true. And that's a bit of a battleground, because some people would argue that religion is not really like a thing in itself. It's more like a black box, which can have just about anything put into it when you essentially are trying to conquer and assimilate a different culture. And so what happens to pagans in the Middle Ages is that mostly Christian church people, mostly men, usually don't rate what they do in terms of ritual practice as really religion. In Latin, there's a distinction between religio, religion, and superstitio, superstition. And we still use both of those words in English, but they mean a little bit different things now, I guess. But the church idea was you could have like arguments with Jews and with later on with Muslims, because they at least believed in the one true God, and they acknowledge that they were people of the book, you know, the book being the Bible. But with pagans, you couldn't do that. There was no common ground. And so what normally happened was that their beliefs and practices were categorized either as superstitions, which was about the mildest thing, or as actually demonic. You know, their gods, on a generous perspective for medieval churchmen, were either just non-existent, and so they were idiots to believe in them, or they were actually real and they were demons sent to deceive. And in that case, they needed Christianity much more. They needed to be converted to be brought into the church. And I think we saw a lot of the same kinds of things in the Americas, here in Australia, where I live, in New Zealand and in the Pacific. The Indigenous peoples, their religions looked too different for the colonists and the missionaries to really understand them. And so it was easier just to push a kind of wholesale dismissal and begin with, well, they need to be made to become Christians. And that's just how it goes. And if you think about how old this idea is, you know, this idea that you bring religion with colonialism, there was a 7th century Frankish king, Dagobert II, and he actually said openly, it's recorded in historical chronicle, conversion should go hand in hand with conquest. And when we go a little bit later into the late 8th century and the early 9th century, you've got Charlemagne, who takes that to an absolutely extreme degree. And when he is conquering Saxony, for example, quite often, you know, numbers in the thousands were executed for refusing baptism.